Blackheart, the leader of the Red Corsairs, the Tyrant of Badab. The name spreads fear throughout the Imperium. But who is he? How did he rise to power? And why did he turn from the Emperor's light? At the edge of the Imperium, where the Emperor's light thins and reality itself begins to fray, lies one of the most unstable regions of the galaxy, the Maelstrom. A vast warp rift, second only to the Eye of Terror in scale and volatility. For millennia, it has poured forth mutants, renegades, pirates, and worse, creating a constant grinding pressure on the surrounding Imperial territories. Guarding this frontier was never a simple duty, but for one chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, it would become both their purpose and their doom. The Astral Claws began as a proud chapter of Astartes. Created during the 35th millennium, they were warriors of precision, discipline, and reliability, far from the reckless buccaneers they would later become. Assigned to the Maelstrom Zone, their charge was clear: defend the Imperium's border against the countless threats that emerged from the rift. For generations, the Astral Claws fulfilled this duty with distinction. Yet, it was a responsibility that demanded far more than any one chapter could provide. The Maelstrom was not a single war, but 1,000 small ones, stretching across centuries. Simply holding the line required constant resources, constant reinforcements, and constant sacrifice. Still, the Astral Claws endured. They developed a reputation for efficiency and a hard resolve, even as the region's stability worsened. But it wouldn't be until the rise of a particular warrior, Huron, that the chapter's fate would truly begin to shift. Huron was a warrior of exceptional capability. Quickly rising through the ranks, he proved himself as both a tactician and a commander. The Astral Claws were not known for political ambition or charismatic leaders, but Huron stood out from the crowd. He distinguished himself. He demonstrated a rare combination of operational brilliance and uncompromising force of will. By the early years of M41, he had become a captain of high standing, entrusted with major engagements around the Maelstrom, and called upon regularly to stabilize sectors that came under threat. By the time of the late 41st millennium, Chapter Master Varduk of the Astral Claws fell in battle. The chapter needed a successor who could maintain their long and difficult vigil over the Maelstrom. Huron was chosen, not simply for his combat ability, but for his vision. He understood better than anyone the worsening situation in the Maelstrom and the falling support they received from the wider Imperium. Under Huron's leadership, the Astral Claws adopted a far more aggressive doctrine. They struck deeper into enemy territory, launched more daring raids, and carried out wider-ranging security operations. Their success earned them widespread recognition and intense scrutiny. It was during Huron's command that the Imperium reorganized the region's defences into one cooperative structure, the Maelstrom Wardens. This coalition included not only the Astral Claws, but also the Lamenters, the Mantis Warriors, and the Executioners. In theory, the Wardens were meant to share the burden of defending such a hostile frontier. But, in practice, Huron was a dominant force. The Astral Claws had the strongest fleet, the most centralized command structure, and the most aggressive operational posture. It was inevitable then that Huron became the de facto leader of the entire coalition. And for a time he excelled. Attacks from pirates and renegade groups decreased. Trade routes were forcibly reopened. Several rebellious worlds were brought back under control. The Wardens were achieving what few Imperial forces ever achieved in the Maelstrom region, a measure of stability. These successes, however, came at a price. Huron's campaigns were extensive, and the cost was enormous. Reinforcements from the wider Imperium were slow, unreliable, or non-existent. The Astral Claws received less support than their casualties demanded. Supply lines were strained, recruitment quotas were exceeded, and still the Maelstrom threatened to unravel every hard-fought gain the Huron made. As a result, Huron began to believe, maybe not without reason, that the Imperium was failing its own defenders. They were not being given the resources they need. And if the Maelstrom was ever to be truly contained, he would need to take matters into his own hands. This shift in mindset marked a quiet turning point. The moment where the Astral Claws story stopped being one of duty and became one of escalation. With each campaign Huron made in defense of the Maelstrom, he pushed harder. He demanded higher ties from nearby system. He requisitioned resources without waiting for administratum approval, and expanded the Astral Claws fleet far beyond regulation limits. As a result, his chapter grew stronger, but more secretive, more insular, and increasingly at odds with Imperial authorities. The Astral Claws were still loyal in these early years. Their actions were justified, at least on their own calculations. But Huron's command style, once admired for its decisiveness, began to edge into something harsher and more unilateral. Inside the Maelstrom zone, he was seen as a stabilizing force. Outside of it, he was becoming a problem to be solved. A commander who was no longer waiting for permission. By the time the Administratum began questioning the Astral Claws resource reports, ship registries, and recruitment numbers, the situation had already escalated beyond diplomacy. Huron was not simply fortifying his chapter, he was building a war machine, one capable of sustaining long-term operations without the oversight of the Imperium. And soon, the Imperium would demand answers that Huron had no intention of giving them. The stage was set. The Astral Claws stood at the height of their power. The Maelstrom was momentarily subdued, but tensions were arising, and the Imperium was preparing to intervene. What began as a necessary effort to defend a hostile frontier was evolving into the opening act of one of the most significant civil conflicts in the modern Imperium, the Badab War. First, the Administratum demanded proof the Astral Claws were complying with all their Imperial tithe laws. Huron ignored them. The Segmentum Command demanded the truth about the chapter's size. Huron refused. The Inquisition demanded oversight. Huron threatened them. And finally, when the Imperium attempted to enforce compliance through the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Firehawks chapter, Huron made his position clear. He would not yield. Not to a distant bureaucracy. Not to rival chapters. Not to anyone. A war that would engulf dozens of worlds. A war that would fracture the Astartes. A war that would consume the Astral Claws themselves was on the horizon. The seeds of the conflict were sown long before the first shot was fired. Long before the first Loyalist fleet translated into the Badab sector, and long before the Astral Claws would be branded traitors to the Imperium. What began as administrative pressure, border disputes, and bureaucratic neglect gradually hardened into a standoff that neither side could back down from. This is the story of how a frontier dispute spiraled into one of the largest Space Marine civil wars since the Horus Heresy. The turning point came with a seemingly simple demand: compliance with Imperial tithes. By this time, Huron had been chapter master of the Astral Claws for decades. The Maelstrom Wardens, under his direction, had brought relative stability to a region that had known only centuries of chaos. But that stability required resources, and the Astral Claws operations had expanded far beyond what the Administratum believed was standard procedure. When auditors attempted to inspect the Astral Claws tithe records, logistic reports and recruitment data, they found discrepancies. Missing documentation, redacted entries, fleet assets unaccounted for. Enough to suggest that the Astral Claws were operating well beyond their remit, and far beyond the strength that they were authorized to have. Seeing this, the Administratum demanded full compliance. Huron refused them. In Huron's mind, the demand bordered on insult. He believed the Imperium had abandoned the Maelstrom, and that the Astral Claws were just compensating for that neglect. Every bolter shell, every vessel he had under his command, and every new recruit he had amassed simply to maintain the frontier. Pausing those operations for an audit was, in his eyes, not just impractical, it was a direct threat to the region's stability. So, Huron made a decision that would alter history. He ordered his forces to deny Imperial inspectors access to Badab Primaris. This was the moment the Imperium could no longer ignore. The Imperium's first response was to escalate the matter to the higher lords of Terra. The Astral Claws' refusal to comply wasn't merely obstruction. According to Imperial law, it bordered on sedition. A formal inquiry was raised, and the matter was passed to the Tribunal of the High Lords. The response at first was measured. The Imperium attempted diplomacy. They issued summons, communiques, and regulatory demands. Huron rejected each one. With every refusal, the gap between the Imperium and the Astral Claws widened. What had begun as a simple bureaucratic dispute was evolving into a constitutional crisis. The Astral Claws did not stand alone. The Maelstrom Wardens as a group had operated together for decades, and Huron's influence over them was considerable. The Mantis Warriors and Lamenters had fought alongside the Astral Claws in countless engagements. The Executioners respected Huron for his martial prowess and decisive leadership. So, when the Imperium demanded the Astral Claws stand down, Huron widened the issue, framing it not just as defiance, but a matter of survival for the wider Maelstrom region. He argued that the Administratum did not understand the Maelstrom, that abandoning their hard-won gains would throw the entire region into chaos, and that the Warden's first duty was to protect the frontier, not to bow to the demands of distant bureaucrats. Some chapters found this stance compelling. Others saw it as dangerously close to an act of rebellion. The lines of war were being drawn. In one of his first overt acts, Huron shocked the Segmentum authorities. Luf Huron formally declared the Badab sector a semi-independent region. He claimed that he and the Maelstrom Wardens would continue to defend the Imperium, but without the interference of the Administratum. This was deemed by the Imperium to be an illegal declaration, a refusal of their authority. And, to enforce his position, Huron took an unprecedented step. He seized control of the entire Badab sector's tithe collection infrastructure. No resources would leave the region without his approval. The Imperium now considered the Astral Claws dangerously close to open rebellion, and they began to mobilize. The first chapter tasked with enforcing compliance was the Firehawks. Renowned for their direct methods and fast results, they were ordered to bring Huron to heel, through force if necessary. But when the Firehawks fleet entered the Badab system, they encountered something extraordinary. The Astral Claws had fortified the sector far beyond any expectations. They had defensive orbital arrays, minefields, interdiction platforms, entire armoured battle groups stationed on Badab Primaris. In addition, they had a highly organised fleet prepared for war. The Firehawks attempted a series of boarding actions and system scans, but each one only served to raise tensions further, and the situation escalated rapidly. The first confirmed engagement of the war occurred when Firehawks vessels attempted to forcibly board an Astral Claws cruiser, seeking to seize all the tithe documentation. The Astral Claws resisted, sparking a brief but violent naval skirmish. The casualties were limited, but symbolically, the line had been crossed. The Badab War had begun. The Imperium, finally recognizing the full gravity of the situation, ordered a full-scale intervention force to be formed. A coalition of Space Marine chapters were assembled under the authority of the Firehawks and, later, the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions. The full Loyalist coalition eventually included the Marines Errant, the Salamanders, the Raptors, and others as the war progressed. Their objective was simple: bring the Badab sector back under Imperial control, by force if necessary. Opposing them, standing behind Huron, stood the secessionist coalition, led by the Astral Claws, but reinforced by several other chapters for their own varied reasons. They included the Mantis Warriors, bound by duty to the Maelstrom, the Lamenters, swayed by Huron's argument and starved for support after their tragic history, and finally the Executioners, who were honouring a blood oath to Huron. Together, they formed a powerful alliance with strong naval capability and centuries of Maelstrom-hardened warfare experience. The first phase of the Badab War was dominated by fleet actions. Naval control was essential. Whoever held the void lanes controlled access to the entire sector. Huron understood this better than anyone. The Astral Claws fleet was far stronger than the Imperium anticipated. Larger, better supplied, and shockingly well coordinated. Years of expanding their armories and shipyards were now paying off. The earliest of the Loyalist attempts to penetrate Badab space were met with a series of tactical actions. Hit-and-run strikes, well-timed ambushes, and fortified choke points. Several Loyalist vessels were destroyed or crippled before they even reached orbit. Seeing the results of their first foray into Maelstrom space, the Imperium recognized that the situation required more disciplined leadership. Command of the Loyalist coalition was handed to the Red Scorpions chapter master, Karab Kulm. Calm, methodical, and unwavering in his adherence to Imperial law, Kulm became the anchor for the Loyalist cause. Under his leadership, the Loyalists reorganized into a multi-theater force, coordinating their naval, planetary, and infiltration operations with far greater precision. One of the most significant early engagements of the war involved the Lamenters. Seeking to limit casualties, the Lamenters attempted to negotiate with the Loyalist commanders, arguing that the conflict was the result of political failure, not treachery. But diplomacy collapsed, and the Minotaurs were unleashed. In a series of brutal engagements, the Minotaurs outmatched the Lamenters through sheer ferocity and overwhelming force. Ships were boarded, fleets shattered, and the Lamenters suffered overwhelming losses. Eventually, they were surrounded, crippled, and forced to surrender. Their withdrawal marked the first major blow to the Secessionist alliance, and a major shift in the momentum of the conflict. Not all Secessionist chapters stood by Huron unconditionally. The Executioners joined the conflict simply to honour a blood debt. But they had little patience for politics. Their focus was singular: uphold their oath, and fight with honour, and leave. When the Loyalists confronted them directly, they negotiated terms. In a rare moment of chivalry amidst the war, both sides agreed to a duel of champions. The duel ended with the Loyalist champion slain, granting the Executioners the honour they sought. With their obligation fulfilled, they withdrew from the war, refusing to participate further. Huron's alliance suffered another blow. The Mantis Warriors attempted a different tactic, seeking to fight a guerrilla warfare. They fought with surgical precision, turning their homeworlds into lethal traps. They executed ambushes amongst dense jungles, orchestrated perfect hit-and-run strikes, and used their intimate knowledge of their sector to devastating effect. The Loyalists spent months rooting out Mantis Warrior strongholds. Each victory they paid in blood, each advance slowing them down. But despite their skill, the Mantis Warriors were increasingly isolated. With the Lamenters defeated and the Executioners withdrawing from the war, they alone could not hold the frontier. The Badab War dissolved into a series of conflicts, too many to go into in this video. But by the later stages of the war, the conflict had narrowed to a single focal point, Badab Primaris, the home of the Astral Claws and the heart of the secessionist rebellion. This was the fortress that Huron had been fortifying for decades. This was the siege of Badab. The Imperium's forces started by launching a full-scale naval assault, breaking through layer after layer of orbital defenses. Boarding torpedoes, thunderhawks, and drop pods rained down upon the surface. The fighting was savage. The Astral Claws, hardened veterans of a dozen frontier wars, fought with a grim resolve. They would not give up this planet lightly. But despite their fierce opposition, the Imperium forces pressed relentlessly, burning through the outer defenses and pushing deeper into the planet's hive cities and defensive complexes. As the defenses started to collapse, Huron revealed the extent of his preparations. Entire war factories lay hidden beneath Badab Primaris. Secret gene vaults, expanded recruitment centers, fortified redoubts. The Astral Claws' numbers had grown far beyond Codex limits. To the Loyalists, this was hard proof of treachery. To Huron, it was a necessity. The Imperium had failed him, leaving him no choice but to build up the force himself necessary to defend the Maelstrom. The battle raged on. Both sides took heavy casualties. The Astral Claws fought with the fury of warriors defending their home, but the Loyalists kept advancing. It was only a matter of time. The Red Scorpions were the ones to lead the final assault on Huron's command bastion. Loyalist forces tore through the last defensive lines, and amidst the chaos, Huron himself emerged to confront the attackers in brutal close combat. Huron slew many of them, but even he could not stop the inevitable. During the final clash, Captain Drukal Androcles of the Star Phantoms fatally wounded Huron with a melter blast. The tyrant fell, and the Badab War was ended. The war burned for almost a solar decade, consuming stars, planets, and billions of lives. 17 Space Marine chapters fought on its many bloody battlefields. And now, its story was over. But Huron was not finished. In the final hours of the siege, a surviving core of Astral Claws evacuated their leader. They fled through secret tunnels and concealed starports, specially built escape routes, that had been prepared long before the Imperial forces entered the system. Seeking refuge, the remnants of the chapter escaped into the Maelstrom, taking their mortally wounded master with them. By the time the Loyalists fully secured the stronghold, they found only destruction and the ashes of a once proud and renowned chapter. With Badab Primaris fallen and the Secessionist alliance dissolved, the war effectively ended. The Imperial forces restored control, even though many worlds were devastated beyond recovery. The Astral Claws were declared renegades. Their chapter name was stricken from Imperial records, and the surviving loyal elements were folded into other chapters or simply executed. The structure of the Maelstrom Wardens were disbanded. The region descended once more into chaos. But somewhere within the warp storms of the Maelstrom, Huron Blackheart lived. The guns had fallen silent. Imperial banners stood over the ruins of Badab Primaris. The war was over, but victory came at a terrible cost. Entire worlds burned, chapters crippled, and the Astral Claws, once renowned defenders of the Imperium, were shattered beyond recognition. Yet the story did not end with the fall of Badab, for in the shadows of the Maelstrom, a wounded tyrant was about to rise again. When Imperial forces breached Huron's final redoubt, they found no body, no corpse, only charred armor fragments and signs of a hurried evacuation. In truth, the Tyrant of Badab had survived, but only just. Severely wounded, half his body burned away and barely clinging to life, Huron was spirited to safety by the remnants of his inner circle. His surviving warriors fled into the warp storms, abandoning their doomed homeworld and vanishing into the chaos of the Maelstrom. It was here, amid shattered asteroids and swirling warp currents, that Huron's transformation truly began. Huron's injuries were catastrophic. His lungs burned, his flesh melted away. His right arm had even been torn apart in the final battle. Even for an Astartes, survival was unlikely. But Huron did not die. His few surviving apothecaries and tech marines rebuilt him, replacing ruined flesh with bionics and augmetics. They carved new life into the remains of their chapter master. Where the Emperor's genecraft failed, Mechanicus salvage and Maelstrom-born technology took over. When Huron finally rose again, he was no longer Luft Huron, who once defended the Imperium's borders. The tyrant had returned, but he was changed. Scarred, augmented, hardened, and filled with rage. From this rebirth came a new name, whispered first by his surviving warriors, then by every terrorized world along the Maelstrom's edge. Huron Blackheart. The Astral Claws who fled with their master faced a grim truth. They could never return. Their chapter was gone, deleted from Imperial records, purged from the annals, condemned collectively as traitors and heretics. Their only option was survival. And survival in the Maelstrom meant abandoning every code, every law, every structure they had known. Some became mercenaries, others raiders, but most remained loyal to Huron, drawn to the only authority they had left. These warriors, battle-scarred, exiled, and burning with resentment, would form the core of a new force, a new power within the Maelstrom. In the aftermath of the brutal Badab War, Huron saw opportunity. Pirate fleets roamed the Maelstrom unchecked. Renegade warbands fought endless wars over small scraps of territory. Mutant enclaves, rebel worlds, and outlaw colonies drifted in and out of existence. But for the first time in centuries, here was a figure capable of uniting them. Under Huron's command, these scattered forces were consolidated, sometimes diplomatically, far more often through brutal conquest. Ships were seized, pirate kings executed, renegade warbands bent the knee or obliterated. From this chaotic crucible emerged Huron's new faction, the Red Corsairs. The Red Corsairs were not a traditional Chaos Warband. They were something far more dangerous. They were a combination of ex-Astral Claws forming the disciplined core, traitorous Astartes from dozens of sources that flocked to the new power over time. Pirates, renegades, and outlaw psychers swelling the ranks. Captured Imperial vessels pressed into service, and a growing network of distorted warp forges deep within the Maelstrom, providing the Red Corsairs with all they needed to wage brutal warfare. The Red Corsairs were a hybrid force, half organized military, half predatory empire. And at the very top sat Huron Blackheart, a tyrant reborn in the darkness, with one clear purpose: rebuild his power and strike back at the Imperium that abandoned him. The years that followed, Huron asserted control over vast segments of the Maelstrom. Former rebel worlds, pirate enclaves, and renegade space stations, all were brought to heel. Under his iron grip, the Maelstrom became more unified than it had been in centuries. Smugglers paid tribute, warbands swore fealty. Splinter fleets flocked to his banners in exchange for resources, protection, or out of simple fear. Slowly, inevitably, the Tyrant of Badab became the tyrant of the Maelstrom. From their strongholds deep in the rift, Huron launched repeated raids into Imperial space. These were not random acts of violence. They were calculated strikes designed to punish the Imperium, steal their resources, and replenish his growing army. The results of such raids were widely successful. He managed to capture entire Imperial vessels, sometimes even battle barges. he was able to successfully subjugate renegade Astartes chapters, swelling his own numbers. He had successful bold raids into the Segmentum Obscurus and Ultima Segmentum. He carried out high-profile kidnappings of Imperial officials and nobles, and successful attack runs on supply convoys, star forts, and frontier systems. Huron's tactical experience as chapter master of the Astral Claws was now paying dividends. Unlike many of the other Chaos warbands, driven purely by ritual, madness, or the capricious demands of their gods, the Red Corsairs continued to operate with precision. Their structure remained closer to that of an Astartes chapter than any Chaos cult. Huron demanded order, discipline, and loyalty, traits often lacking in the warbands that called the Maelstrom home. This discipline makes the Red Corsairs uniquely dangerous. It's important to understand, Huron did not become a servant of Chaos in the traditional sense. He was not a champion of any particular god. He bore no demonic mutations, no overt signs of possession. Instead, he uses the warp as a tool. Chaos for him was an avenue to power, a means to grow his strength and punish his enemies. In this sense, Huron became something rare, a renegade warlord with the iron discipline of a chapter master, the ambition of a conqueror, and the red-hot fury of an exile. As the Red Corsairs continued to grow, they adopted a new heraldry: crimson red armour, black hand covering their pauldrons. Any who joined the Red Corsairs painted over their previous allegiances, showing their loyalty to their new master, Huron. They were a force of the betrayed, warriors from chapters who'd been exiled, disgraced, or condemned. Men who had lost everything, and who found in Huron a leader who understood their resentment and allowed them to indulge in it. The Astral Claws had been the first to fall, but they would not be the last. As the decades passed, the true brilliance of Huron's long-term strategy became clear. He established an absolute power within the Maelstrom. He unified the region's pirate and renegade forces, and used the Maelstrom as a base for further expansion. He was not merely raiding the Imperium. He was building something, a counter-empire, born from loss, exile, and fury. And whatever the cost, he would build it strong enough to rival the Imperium. For the Imperium, the Badab War became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even loyal chapters, stretched too thin and abandoned by bureaucracy, could be driven to desperation. For Huron Blackheart, it became something else entirely, a badge of honor, proof that he had resisted the Imperium's neglect and survived when all others would have broken. The war that destroyed the Astral Claws forged the Red Corsairs. Today, Huron Blackheart rules an empire carved from the ruins of his past. His fleets strike across the galaxy. His forces continue to grow with each captured vessel. and he remains one of the few independent power bases that can trouble the Imperium. Huron Blackheart is a tyrant, a renegade, a conqueror, but he is also a survivor shaped by war, betrayal, and the unforgiving frontier of the Maelstrom. The Imperium may have won the Badab War, but the Maelstrom has a long memory, and the tyrant is far from finished.